Garden, and we are ready to start our Elements block of the month, which is a paper piecing block of the month. So today I'd like to give you a little basic overview of paper piecing using our Elements pattern. So we're going to start out, and each of your kits will contain your basic pattern. We have also photocopied all your foundation paper for you. And of course, your kit will have the fabrics that you need. So let me talk a little bit about foundation paper. Foundation paper it has the side that is printed, and it has a plain side. The plain side is where your fabric goes. The printed side is where you sew. When you look at this pattern, you see solid lines and you see a few dashed lines. The solid lines are your sewing lines. The dashed lines are your cutting line. So what you're seeing here is this is between the solid line and the seam line is your seam allowance. So as we're adding fabric, we need to make sure that not only are we covering the spaces for the fabric, but that we are also covering the seam allowance, because we need a seam allowance to sew our pieces together. So it is also helpful to have on hand before you start either pins or a glue stick. I like the Sew Line glue stick. It's refillable, so once I buy the pen, I just need refills for it. Either an iron or a seam roller. I prefer to use the iron, but sometimes because you need to press after each seam, it can get a little much to be up and down to the iron. You will need an add 1/4 ruler or an add 1/8 ruler. You will need a rotary cutter. And when it comes time to trim up the block, you may need a larger ruler to trim the block up when you're done. So we are going to get started. Right here, I'm going to move those out of my way. There are 2 pattern pieces here. I am going to cut them apart. And I am just going to cut between the 2 dashed lines so I leave my seam allowance intact. So I'm just going to give a little rough cut there. Now, I could cut the rest of this paper off, but I'm not going to spend the time on that. So we're going to start with part A here. When you look at this, you will notice that it is labeled A1, A2, A3, 4, 5, and so on. That is the order you're going to lay your pieces down. Now, not all paper piecing foundations are marked quite as nicely as this one. This one also has the fabric color and the size that the fabric was cut. And that cutting information is also on your pattern. So as you cut, you may want to label these pieces for ease of putting them on your foundation paper. So we are going to start and get our first piece on. And you could use a pin here. I'm going to use my glue. And the fabric needs to go on the unprinted side. So I'm going to hold this up to the light, and I'm going to mark with a little glue right in the space. I don't need a whole lot to hold it in place. Now, the first piece can be tricky. It is going to go right side facing up. When I put it on, I'm going to try to have it about a 1/4 inch over the line, and I want to make sure that it's covering all the way out into the seam allowance and over that edge, and is covering the whole thing. So I've got it visually covered. I'm just going to press it down on my glue a little bit, and I'm going to get my second piece. Now, my second piece is going to lay right side down, And on these batiks, you just have to pick which side you like best. And if you're not sure if you're going to cover, you'll get good at just visually seeing if it covers, but up until you feel confident with that, I just put a finger on either side and give it a little flip up to make sure it's covering everything. As you do more foundation paper piecing, you'll be able to kind of know just by looking at it at this point, but initially give it a little test. Now you could pin now, pin down farther so you don't hit the pins with your needle. I'm just going to hold it and I'm going to flip it over and go right to my machine. So I'm going to be sewing on this line between A1 and A2. I like to use a little thinner thread, like a 60 weight thread versus a 50 weight. And I like to put my machine stitch length at about 1.5. I'm going to start a few stitches before the start of the solid line, and I'm going to sew on the solid line. And I'm going to sew about 2 to 3 stitches past that line. I'm going to trim this off, and I'm going to press this open. If you're using your iron, use a dry iron here. Oops, I've got some threads, must have been hanging out. There, okay. Wet paper can get wrinkly, paper can actually even shrink. You want to make sure when you iron that this is fully ironed, that there's no little pleats or folds there. And now we're going to come back to the cutting mat. At this point, you'll either need a piece of heavyweight cardstock, or if you have the Out a Quarter Plus, it has a thin side for doing this. I'm going to fold back on the line between A2 and A3. Fold that back. I'm going to use the lip on my Out a Quarter, and I am going to trim off the excess fabric. Now, I'm going to add my piece 3, fabric A, that's my dark purple. And the trick here, you can see this is at an angle. So when I flip this over and I'm on the other side, I want to make sure that I've shifted this fabric far enough over to be at least 1/4 inch past this point, and that I'm still covering the seam allowance. So I'm going to come to the other side. I think that's my right side. I'm going to give it a little test that I'm covering everything. I can see I've got the seam allowance covered, and I am covered. So I'm lining up. I'm not going to pin, but you can. Now I'm sewing on the line between A2 and A3, starting a few stitches before. Ending a few stitches after, cutting off. Giving Carol a challenge with the camera, and pressing. So I'm going to start now. We've been going upwards, but now we can see this piece is A7. Here's A4 across here. So I need to fold back on this line between A1, 2, and 3 and A4. I'm going to fold back on that. Now, I've stitched a little bit here, so just give your paper a little pull. It's okay, it doesn't affect the stitches, but that'll let you fold this paper back. If you tear your paper, just use a little bit of Scotch tape. It And you can keep using it. Got rid of those extra pieces. And now I'm going to add this A4. Put this on. I'm holding up. I can see I'm good, I'm covered. If you need to give it a little flip up test, do that. I'm starting a few before. And a few after. Now in this pattern, we're making 4 of the A units and 4 of the B units. You could do this assembly line style and be working on all 4 at the same time. I'm going to fold back between 4 and 5 on that line. Trim off that excess. And now I need my fabric E. And again, when I put this on, I want to make sure that I'm covering out past the seam allowance, that I'm getting all these points and areas covered. We've got a nice big piece to do this. The cutting on this pattern is very generous, but I do like, particularly on triangles, to give a little test flip to make sure I'm getting past the seam allowance. And I did shift that a little bit to the right as I did that, and that gave me good coverage. As I say, as you do this, you'll start to get shifting the fabric left and right to fully cover everything. So here we go. Uh-oh, look what I did. I caught my fabric. So, oh,
she is real.
I need a seam ripper. Oh, let me grab a seam ripper. Carol will show you all my little tools while I grab a seam ripper.
We have the ruler, we have the rotary cutter, we have the, I always call it the steamroller, and she's got her glue, and then she had all of her fabrics lined up so that she knew exactly which fabrics to get. So she's very organized.
Except for the seam ripper, which I really didn't plan on having to rip. I had good confidence, right?
Guess what? She's just like us.
I'm just like you guys. So because the stitch length is smaller, it's a little harder to rip out, but I can do it. Carol's gonna watch me do this. Thank goodness I have my glasses.
I'm glad it's her and not me.
Yes. So it's not always fun to rip these tiny stitches, but these tiny stitches will really make a difference when it's time to pull the paper out. Your paper will pull out easier and your stitches won't get distorted. And that's, so takes a little work to get into these small stitches. Helps if your seam ripper has a nice tight. I will mention that sometimes out on the internet I see people talk about back stitching. And just like when you're quilting, if you're going to sew back over that seam, you really don't need to back stitch because you're going to come back and sew another seam across it. And I think back stitching leaves a lot of heaviness in your thread, and it's harder to sew your, it's harder to. So now I am making sure I don't have a fold there. See, if I would have pinned, that would have solve that, but now I'm not going to sew all the way back across. I'm going to sew until I go 3 or 4 stitches over the sewing that I did not rip out, because again, the thread would be pretty heavy if I double sew over it. So I'm just going to get rid of those little extra threads. Okay, now I'm sewn. There we go. Good for you to see what can happen. Okay. And sometimes it's a good idea after you press to hold it up and really make sure that you covered. Because once you start adding pieces, it would not be fun to have to rip out multiple seams. Okay, so I'm going to move fairly quickly through the rest of this. I'm doing A5 and A6 and trimming. And I am just covering the little corner. I do have to hold this up so I can see where that little corner is. And it's right there. I'm going to look good. If I were going to do all 4 pieces at once, at this point, I would just pull this out and start the next piece right in. But I'm just doing one piece right now to show you. Okay, so we're all the way out to 6. So now we're going to head back up here to the A7. So again, I've got some places where I've sewed into the A7. I'm just going to pull the fabric back, the paper back from those stitches so that I can fold it back. And I'm going to trim with my add-a-quarter. And I'm going to add my D. Looking good. I'm just checking with the light. If you had a light box, you could do that. Got Carol moving back and forth pretty fast now to follow me. Oops. Need a little wrinkle there. Okay. Gonna fold back between A7 and A8. Trim. And I'm going to add A8. Again, just holding it up to the light, making sure I'm covering the seam allowance. And off I go. Here in the classroom, I've got this nice rolly chair. I can roll right back and forth. Okay. I'm going to fold back between A8 and A9. Trim. And I'm going to add B1. Did I lose a piece somewhere? No, I did not. I got them all. Okay, again, just making sure I'm covering all the seam allowances. And I just have one more piece to put on. Put this on. This is another pointy triangle, but because it's going narrower, there should be no issue to get it all covered. There I go. press that. Okay. Now at this point, it looks pretty wonky and crazy. You think, what? But I'm gonna lay this down, and now I'm gonna trim on the dashed lines. So I'm gonna line this up just so I'm cutting right on the dashed lines. Not a whole lot to trim on this side. Oops, I'm going to move this forward. I'm not all the way on the cutting mat. That looks good. And again, make sure it's the dashed lines and not the solid lines, otherwise you won't have a seam allowance. Okay, now you will notice on here, there's some little lines here on the corners. It's optional if you want to trim those or not, but it does help with matching up a triangle to a triangle to have those trimmed. So if I want to do that, I line up on one line, nip that corner. You can see there's still a little bit of line left because this is actually going to be angled 2 ways. I line that up, nip it off. It gives me this little kind of point, and when I go to line it up with the other triangles in the pattern, it will give me a better lineup. I won't have the dog ears that you have to worry about. This will make it so I can line it right up without having to worry about dog ears. Okay, are we ready for the reveal? Look at that. Few stray threads to move away, but it's gorgeous and it's perfect. So, here's the thing about paper piecing. It takes a little bit longer. It's kind of like making a log cabin block. You've got to press at each addition. There's a little bit of fabric waste because you've got some extra pieces you're trimming off. But, I mean, it's really not too bad. It's not too much, but it's really worth that little bit of waste to get something that's so absolutely perfect. And you can get extremely intricate with paper piecing. Sometimes you can end up with little sections that are barely a 1/4 inch square. It's amazing the precision. So sometimes it's just worth the little bit of extra time it takes and the little bit of extra fabric waste to get such perfection. So each month you will make 4 A's, 4 B's. When you go to sew these together, you are going to want to get your pins out, and you can pin through these intersection points, matching up all your points. And this line, we haven't sewn on this yet. Those are the lines we're going to sew on when we piece the pieces together. You don't want to sew on them right now. We just sewed on the lines between the pieces, but not on this outside edge. We'll sew there as the pieces sew together. I don't like to remove the paper until I'm actually putting the quilt together. It helps stabilize any bias edge that has occurred as we've cut. It helps keep everything in place. So I will wait till I sew it all together, and I will probably even wait till I sew other blocks to it, and then I can start pulling paper out. I think you will really love this block of the month. You will love the quilt because it will be absolute perfection. If you need a reference at home, you can always watch the video again, but we do recommend Nancy Mahoney's Learn to Paper Piece book. It has nice step-by-step instruction, and it's got some beautiful paper piecing patterns in it, and you will always have a reference guide. and we do carry that here in the shop if you would like to get that. If you ever have any questions while you're working on your block of the month, you're welcome to call us on the phone, 916-483-2955. Or if you live in the area, you can drop on in and we can help you get going with your project. Thanks for watching today, and we know you're going to love this quilt.